First, the manufacturers are getting behind the mobility transition that's going on, and new models are being released with enormous regularity. Tesla's Model 3 is being developed, although delays are there. And I find quite striking, people are trying to electrify all forms of transport. 2 years ago, if you'd said we want to electrify heavy road transport, people would have thought you were nuts. Even in Norway, people are thinking about electrifying commercial flight. So there are vehicles being released, but also people are thinking very cleverly about how to electrify all sorts of other parts of the global transportation sector. Governments following the lead of manufacturing and in many places banning the internal combustion engine from some future date. In GB, we're talking about 2040. China wants 7 million EVs within 7 years from now. I think the big story that's emerging in EVs, though, now is around charging infrastructure and the integration of EVs. And in a sense, it parallels what we've seen with renewables, which is build lots of renewables was phase one, and then when we've got a bunch of them, we need to work out how we're going to integrate them into the grid. And with EVs, I think the story is the same. We're going to build a bunch of them, and then we need to work out how to integrate these in a clever way. Aurora's thinking very hard about that, and I think the next year or two we'll see a lot more thinking on electric vehicle integration. Our view from this chart of a recent research report shows peak demand if you've got smart charging on the right, and if you've got what we call dumb charging of EVs in the middle in the UK. And this on the left is a case of no EVs. And as you can see, we think if you do smart charging with EVs, the impact on peak demand is very small, close to zero. I'd also add, I think there are enormous grid benefits from having EVs if we use them in clever ways, but that's probably a topic for later in the day. Batteries are booming as well, and while their growth has not been as substantial as some other technologies, renewables and other areas, we're at a gigawatt contracted in GB. The US has seen 0.5 gigawatt in the last couple of years. South Australia acquired a 100 megawatt battery, which Tesla delivered in 100 days, although it didn't work out so well for the Premier, who's just been elected out of office in the last few days in South Australia. So betting on Elon Musk is not always the best strategy for a politician, although historically that has been the case. But batteries are dominating very narrow slithers of the power market. So the frequency response markets in this country are starting to be dominated by batteries. And that's not just a GB phenomenon. In Germany, we think 50% of the frequency containment reserve will be covered by batteries. So they're dominating, but they're dominating in niches rather than the whole system at the moment. And they're being deployed. Flexible capacity, and by that I mean batteries, peaking plants, and demand-side response is playing a huge role in this high intermittency grid. This has delivered capacity from the GB capacity market since it was instigated. Of the 8 gigawatts of new capacity, 7 is peaking plants, either peakers, batteries, and DSR. And I suspect that most of that DSR is peakers and batteries, by the way. So essentially, these two technologies are coming to dominate new build in this market, which is what you would expect in a world in which, if it's windy, your plant's not going to be running. You want a cheap plant that can flex up and down quickly. And then finally, I've talked about the technologies, I've talked about the policies. We're starting to see very big changes in the market structure in our industry, particularly salient in light of E.ON and RWE's deal around the energy assets and their broader assets recently. But it's not surprising that with this amount of technology and policy change, we would be rethinking the way organisations are structured in this market. And we're moving from a world in which the dominant model of vertical integration is being challenged, and different market participants are moving out. E.ON towards customers and networks, RWE towards generation and trading, Centrica towards customers and networks, SSE should probably be on the left-hand side rather than the bottom middle, but it's getting out of customers and services. So we're seeing some tectonic shifts in the structure of the industry that I think this last year has really majored on. Good. Now, so that's context for the day. Let me jump into I suppose a couple of points around how we want to run today. First of all, well, I suppose in terms of how we generally run it, in light of all this massive change, the aims of coming together really haven't changed very much since we started doing it. It's basically an idea to get out of London, come to Oxford, stand back, and take stock with a group of senior decision makers in energy markets. To engage, to discuss openly, and not really necessarily to get to any conclusions here, but rather just reflect on a turbulent world and perhaps collectively shed some light where we can. The forum also builds on a great year of momentum for Aurora. So we're now providing detailed energy modelling across European markets from Ireland in the west to Poland and the Czech Republic in the east. And the company continues to grow apace. We're providing critical analysis around subsidy-free renewables and low-subsidy renewables to make the sophisticated analytical economic arguments for investment in these technologies. And in subsidy-free renewables, we think we're at the tip of a very large iceberg in terms of where energy markets in Europe are going. And Matthias will speak a bit more to that later. And we're continuing to lead our work on the value of flexibility in energy markets, another trend that we think will characterize the next decade, the requirement for peaking capacity and batteries in high intermittency energy markets. Briefly on some housekeeping. First, really importantly, we're delighted to have as our title partners this year Barclays. This collaboration builds on a long-term relationship with Barclays, and the level of ambition that we've achieved in the event this year would not have been possible but for our sponsors and supporters. So many thanks to Barclays. We'll be having polls throughout the day, and we've introduced polling technology because we'd like you to feel personally engaged. We'd like you to share your knowledge so that we can collectively shine some light. And I think there's a slide coming up, maybe I've got the slide, on the polling technology. So I'm always loath to encourage people to pick up their mobile phones during conferences, but I'm going to do it here. We're using a technology called Slido, and to be able to vote today, you need to log into slido.com. Hashtag Aurora Forum is how you log in. Select the room, which is South School is the big one, room 6 is downstairs, and then you can answer the poll. So you have my blessing to pull out your smartphone and look at Slido. The schedule is in your agenda booklets, so I won't go into it here. And as you've experienced, I take time very seriously, so I have a bell, and I'm going to be using this to round up people in between sessions. So I've never used it on a group this big, but I'm reasonably confident. So keep your ears open during breaks, and I'll be approaching and herding people back into the room. We have a Twitter hashtag. It's also hashtag Aurora Forum. So I know there are tweeters out there. If you're a tweeter, please tweet with hashtag Aurora Forum so we can gather the conversation together. The press are here. So it's the first time we've done this for the Spring Forum. We've got to a size where the Chatham House rule, I think, becomes more difficult, and we've invited the press, which is great, and we're really chuffed to have a number of distinguished members of the press here, but just be aware of that. And if you don't want to be quoted in the newspapers next week, be careful who you talk to, and maybe don't speak too loudly in your conversations. Great. So now, hopefully by now you've downloaded the app because we have our first poll of the day. And Simon's going to bring it up. It relates to that last point I made. So the question is, will there be movement away from the vertically integrated business model over the next decade? And there are three, okay, good, people have started voting. The first person said yes. Oh, the first 6 people said yes. Wow. So the first answer was yes, utilities will have to specialise. The second option is no, relevance of vertically integrated utilities will stay roughly the same. And the third is no, vertically integrated utilities will be more relevant in future than ever. So pick the answer that most closely resembles your view of the world over the next decade. Good. So we've had 55 votes. Great. Okay. I don't know if we formally stop voting or not. Okay, interesting. I thought that would be the answer with the most support at the moment. I'd normally call upon someone who said no, vertically integrated utilities will be more relevant in the future than ever, but we don't have time, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot to explain their view. Good. So that's a good note, having sort of adopted some wisdom of the crowds. That's a good point to move into our first session of the day. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dieter Helm to chair the first session of the morning. Dieter doesn't need any introduction in this audience, but for the formality of it, he's a co-founder and non-executive of Aurora. He's a professor at the University of Oxford. He's the independent chair of the Natural Capital Committee and the author of the recent Cost of Energy Review. Dieter, with great pleasure, the floor is yours.